traditional publishers have adapted to this new affiliate model. And, and it's when you look at it in like the long term, back in the 20th century, those publishers had things like classified ads, or big double page magazine spreads that they could charge a lot of money for, and that would pay for the journalism. But unfortunately, what digital publishing did was unbundle all of those different functions. So you could have like a site dedicated to ads, like or classifieds, like Craigslist or something, and that really hit the bottom line for the publishers. And they were trying to monetize using display ads, and display ads quickly, plummeted in value because advertisers realized that nobody's clicking on a banner ad. They're vanishingly small conversions that happen through that. So the affiliate model is great for the publishers because we're producing content that people are looking for. It's high intent. I'm looking for a credit card, so I'm going to go to a trusted website and see what they say about it.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the eMarketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm always super excited to talk to folks within organizations that are doing fun things, in particular that perhaps folks aren't aware of. So I'm super excited to be chatting with Will Kenton, who's the editor-in-chief at Taboola. And you might say, well, Taboola, that's native advertising. Why do they have an editor-in-chief? And so I'll actually let Will explain what the turnkey division is at Taboola and how it came about and what they do for publishers in the ecosystem.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm the editor-in-chief. I started a couple of years ago. Our group, Turnkey, started about 3 years ago. And there were some folks who had been doing publishing for personal finance websites who came to Taboola and pitched the idea to them. Taboola is a great company. It's been growing by leaps and bounds, and they've been trying to add other business lines for their publishers. So they've been around for a decade and more, and they have a lot of relationships with traditional publishers like Bloomberg, CBS News, AP News, Time Magazine, and those kinds of folks. And they were helping them to monetize their sites, but adding these other business divisions has been a way for them to, make their cooperation, these previously existing relationships, more lucrative for everybody. So what Turnkey does is we produce all the content. We're kind of like an in-house publisher for Taboola, and that content lives on the different websites of the companies we're partnered with. So at the moment, we have a partnership with Advanced Media that owns NJ.com, Time Magazine, so time.com. And we just signed a contract with AP News, and we'll be launching that site soon, within the next 3 or 4 weeks, which is going to be both personal finance and e-commerce. So like I said, we're producing all the content, and really the backbone of our group is the SEO group. So, Taboola is a technology company. Our SEOs are deeply knowledgeable about SEO and technology, search technology, digital communications. And so they kind of strategize everything that we want to do, looking for opportunities to rank. And of course, we also have people who are creating the affiliate relationships with the advertisers. We'll write pieces about credit cards or mortgages, home loans. We'll also do reviews of products like couches and snow tires and that kind of stuff. And it lives on, time.com/personal finance. And then, for a bunch of reasons, one of them is we do write great content. The other one is that Time has great domain authority in Google's eyes. So, we write a piece and we don't have to wait several years to get enough backlinks for it to rank. It shoots up into the SERP quickly. So we've been able to monetize, we're in the black on this project already after having only really been live for a little over a year. And that's exciting. So it's a part of the growth talk that our CEO gave during his investor talk recently.
Great, great. Well, yeah, that's sounds like it's certainly taking advantage of the domain authority of the publishing sites in an area where they probably don't have the time or resources or expertise to be able to, do everything that you take on as a result of having both the content and SEO team working hand in hand and the affiliate relationships. But it also doesn't sound like it necessarily competes with the branded content teams if the publishers have branded content teams, right? So if one
Absolutely.
specific advertiser were to come to the publisher and say, I'd like to do some branded content, doesn't seem to step on the toes of your platform at all.
Yeah, they're totally separate. And interestingly, I was out last night with one of my editors that I work with at Taboola and a couple of other people that we know from before. We had all worked together at Dotdash at Investopedia before going our different ways. And some of those alumni have worked at Forbes Advisor, at Fortune Recommends, Bankrate. And we were talking about how traditional publishers have adapted to this new affiliate model. And it's when you look at it in like the long term, back in the 20th century, those publishers had things like classified ads, or big double page magazine spreads that they could charge a lot of money for, and that would pay for the journalism. But unfortunately, what digital publishing did was unbundle all of those different functions. So you could have like a site dedicated to ads, like or classifieds, like Craigslist or something, and that really hit the bottom line for the publishers. And they were trying to monetize using display ads, and display ads quickly, plummeted in value because advertisers realized that nobody's clicking on a banner ad. They're vanishingly small conversions that happen through that. Um, so um, so the affiliate model is great for the publishers because we're producing content that people are looking for. It's high intent. I'm looking for a credit card, so I'm going to go to a trusted website and see what they say about it. And then once they're there, they can click a button and then, apply for the credit card. So it's really kind of a boon for the publishers, especially the traditional publishers, who have a lot of authority and brand equity, but don't have a lot of the infrastructure that has come along with developing this affiliate stuff.
Right, right. Well, I was just returned yesterday from PubCon, which is one of the SEO conferences, and content remains, top of mind for everybody, not just from the regular ranking in a Google SERP or Bing SERP perspective, but also from the perspective of the LLM AIs learning about brands and products and services from the content that's created. Do you feel like that's a secondary benefit for for the overall ecosystem that you're playing in that it's sort of that content is out there and will get digested by LLMs as well?
Well, I mean, it's funny because we work with a lot of freelance writers, and you'll notice when you are shopping around for like a credit card or a couch that many of the writers' names appear across sites. There aren't as many full-time writers anymore as there used to be. But one of those people, I was at a conference last year where the discussion of AI came up. And of course, the question is AI going to take my job? And this writer said, I don't sound like AI, and I'm not worried about people checking my stuff against AI. I'm also not worried about AI taking my job because the AI sounds like me. So my human creativity is what's, feeding the AI. And we also heard opinions on that particular panel about AI as a word tool, I mean, not to replace human creativity. It's sort of like, when accountants went from having paper ledgers to having Excel. They
Mhm.
could do their job faster, they could do it more efficiently, but it's not like, Excel is running itself.
For sure, for sure. Um, so you mentioned that personal finance and e-commerce are the two categories that you're at. I would imagine that finding white space in those categories is actually particularly challenging, right? Whereas a lot of times when if you were just to get an SEO expert in the room and you were to say, what process should I go through in finding white space areas where there was potential to rank if I had a high authority website to place the content on, those wouldn't necessarily be the categories that most people would pick. However, they are high yielding categories from the advertiser perspective. So, how do you guys balance off that sort of difficulty as it relates to chances of success versus monetization equation?
Well, I mean, I think that, our SEO team has been good at finding opportunities. And like I mentioned snow tires earlier, that was one of them. We were doing content last year for Black Friday for Time, and our SEOs saw that there was a lot of search for snow tires, probably because it was coming up. But it's the kind of thing that, a traditional publisher probably wouldn't think about. They're like, they're using their human imagination to figure out like what I would buy if, it's a Black Friday deal and I'd buy mascara and, a new sofa or something like that. But they saw that there was a lot of search through, their SEO tools for snow tires. We wrote a piece about it. We got, an affiliate deal. And actually, I should mention that, Taboola also owns Skim Links, which is, a major affiliate link operation. So, and we get data from them as well. So we wrote the piece about snow tires. We linked it up, and it did really well. Like super outperformed. So those kinds of opportunities are still there. Other things that folks don't think about as being popular and lucrative, but are things like pet insurance. So life insurance is difficult to rank for, or like best credit cards for good credit is probably the hardest thing to rank for. But yeah, there are categories where you can. Of course, I feel like, and you could probably tell me more about this. I'm not a total expert in it, but I feel like there is a delicate balancing between the number of URLs you have on your site, the domain authority, the sort of like math that goes on behind those things as you're trying to boost those really high value, high ROI pages.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are differences of opinion because sort of number of pages on a domain relates to whether or not one should do pruning, right? And there are different opinions on whether or not to prune and to what extent to prune, right? Some folks will say, well, I wrote some of this content 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, and it's never really ranked or driven incremental traffic, but I also have my winners, right? The ones that rank fairly well and are sort of the engine of search related traffic. And there's not a uniform sort of best practice around pruning because Google generally and Bing won't generally advise on pruning, right? But one can certainly make the argument that even from a general user experience perspective, if the content is no longer relevant, then pruning makes sense, right? But archival evergreen content, if the content is still in fact relevant, uh, I think the argument would be, well, it's still relevant to the consumer. The consumer would still be delighted, and so therefore I'll leave it there because perhaps the algorithm would change. So as long, I think if one takes a consumer centric point of view, which Google certainly does, about content delighting the consumer and serving a value. I mean, that's why they called the latest update the helpful content update, right? So I would say from a pruning and number of pages on a domain perspective, as long as that content remains helpful, I think one can make a strong argument for keeping the content there. If there's all sorts of odd edge cases where all of a sudden a piece of content might be hyper relevant on a website. I mean, there might be NJ.com, for example, may have covered a high school basketball, game, 4 years ago, and all of a sudden that person turns pro, right? Who in
Yep.
the article was a profile of some high schooler, on the varsity basketball team, and you could all of a sudden see that being relevant and ranking because there was no search volume until that person turned pro, right? And all of a sudden, that is the most authoritative 4-year-old piece of content on that basketball player. So
Yeah.
I think you just have to be careful when you go into the pruning mode, as an SEO practitioner and as a publisher, right? Is just if you put the consumer first, I think the general thinking is do that. But if it's out of date content or it would actually end up being negative to the consumer, then absolutely pruning, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with that, it's funny because when I was at Investopedia, some 8 or 9 years ago, that site started in 1999, and the bulk of the content was written in 2003, and this is like 35,000 to 40,000 URLs. And the oldest ones, and as the name implies, it's kind of like an evergreen site. But the oldest ones, like what is a PE ratio, had so many high quality backlinks that just like they ranked without even worrying about it. But there was an update in 2017 maybe or 2018 that really started to tank Investopedia's traffic. And so we created this project to go in and revamp all of the URLs, every single one. And there was pruning involved in that as well, but it was fairly small. I mean, they wanted to like keep, that huge cloud of URLs around. And that created a practice at Dotdash, which ended up acquiring Investopedia, that they have like an alarm, I think, in the CMS that says if a piece hasn't been touched in like 12 months, that somebody has to like do something to it to like update it or at least check the facts. Um, and it's funny because, even the most evergreen topic will have examples. So, it would be something like, PE ratios. The standard PE ratio, in the past 20 years has been 15. But then, and that was written in 2003. So he's talking about the 20 years from 1983 to, whatever, 2003. And everything changed after 2008 and it wasn't relevant anymore. And I think that that's an interesting, aspect of publishing now is that, you expect the content to be fresh, and yet at the same time, there's a value in having, these URLs ripen on the vine, like attract a bunch of backlinks. So, trying to understand like how to categorize things so that they remain evergreen, but are also constantly updated. And actually, another thing that I've noticed is dead links, lots and lots of dead links across, the internet, which is annoying because especially when you're looking at an encyclopedia site like Wikipedia, they'll like link to a source or something, and oftentimes it'll be a dead link, which I think you assume that the internet has archived everything forever, but that's true.
Yeah, I mean, you make a valid point that is also apropos to future proofing, right, from the perspective of content, because Perplexity, which is gaining a lot of steam as sort of a new search engine, which is AI driven, does essentially include the citations of where they find the stuff, but not in a typical SERP style, citation, but you can find out where they got that information, right? Which is great for the person who wants to essentially fact check the AI. And
Yeah.
so if a Perplexity, mentions here's a great blurb on PE, the average PE ratio,
Yeah.
a person could then check in on it and maybe get that additional level of granularity as to when it was last updated, if that date is at the top of the article or the top of the piece of content. I do see that revisiting, for those publishers listening or folks who have archival content and they're sort of making that decision whether to prune or update. If it's was seen as authoritative at one point, just make sure it's still authoritative, right? I think you can make a strong argument for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that publishers are now putting a lot more resources into making sure that the content, the entire corpus of content stays fresh. Whereas, in the 20th century, you put all your resources into, creating new content. And then once it was gone, it was like maybe in the library or something, that you would look through the card catalog to find. But yeah, now
Yeah,
it's
you actually bring up an interesting point. I'll have to go back at the few sort of hobby sites that I run that have content on them and see whether or not I'm adequately dating the pieces of content. Because I do feel from the consumer facing perspective, I certainly get exasperated when I do come across a piece of content, which I can sort of tell they wrote it to be evergreen, but it may in fact have statistical references in it. And if I can't figure out when it was written, that that informs my brain as to how much I should trust it, right? Because I don't know when it was written. So I think it may become a best practice if it isn't already to, date pieces of content so that for the consumer's purposes, and that may end up being influential in not just how Google and Bing may prefer or not prefer that content, but how the AIs may prefer or not prefer that content on a go forward basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know a whole lot about the, internal workings of Google still. I imagine that like there's some amount of machine learning, right, obviously, that goes into creating a SERP and like pulling out things like featured snippets and that kind of stuff. And obviously Google has done a great job of it because they're still, the leader in search. Um, but there is a lot of context that I think was intuitive 10 years ago, even, especially things like in a news site, they always have a dateline and like there's always, where and when this is coming from. And as things have become, have been changed by the nature of the internet, like you lose that specificity of content, of context. Um, that it probably has a feedback effect in the search as well. In fact, I remember reading something about how, people were worried that AI generated content was going to have a feedback effect on search so that like, the AIs are like ingesting AI content and like becomes totally divorced from, human perception. It's all machine generated.
Yeah, it's interesting. You bring up the tradition of the dateline, right, at a publisher, but the other sort of tradition at a regular publisher is the byline, right? It always tells you who either individually or as a team wrote this piece.
Mm.
And there was certainly some buzz at PubCon, and there's been some buzz over the last year about the extent to which the individual's byline might become influential in future ranking, both from the perspective of Google and Bing, but also from the perspective of the AI, right? So typically, SEO folks have more thought about just the domain authority of a site, like, oh, it's got great domain authority, it's a highly trusted, highly respected site, and therefore it gets content that lives there gets the benefit of that. But you know, I think there may be sort of a revisitation of authorship, right? In the AI, the future AI generated content world. Of course, you can sort of fake that. I mean, people could potentially even spoof that I generated something, and then you get into the rabbit hole of, well, what if I, attach my authorship to a blockchain so that they can validate that I in fact wrote it. It does really get quite interesting
Yeah.
as we start to think about the who wrote it question and the extent to which that's important. Because within the influencer world, who created the content, that's all that matters, that it came from Cristiano Ronaldo or one of the Kardashians or whomever, or even in the B2B influencer context, right? There are B2B, influencers who are just really understand everything about audio or everything about HDTV, right? And the fact that they were the author, that's all that matters. to their readerships, to their fans, to the people who are consuming that content. So just if you sort of think about that from a mashup perspective, it really does open up some interesting rabbit holes that one can go down with
Oh
regards to
yeah.
authorship.
I think it's, what I love about that insight is that it shows the kind of fundamental differences between platforms and like, Google as a platform for search, right, does a particular thing using certain set of assumptions, and social media is totally different. Social media is really about entertainment, but it's also about your connection, your emotional connection to whoever the face, the author, right, the idea of a person who is trustworthy and like shares your perspective or like cares about you and that kind of stuff. And like I think that influencers can like they can sell all kinds of stuff without having to undergo any factual scrutiny, because that's what authority is. Whereas, when you're searching for things, Google has adopted a different like understanding of authority, and it's like, and I guess they're both social when you think about it, right? I mean, they're both about a number of followers. One is backlinks and the other are like, people on your channel. But
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I'm sure that someday will be a synthesis that like, they'll figure out how to synthesize those things.
right. Yeah, I never really thought about the different nuances between trust and authority, right? A person may in fact trust an influencer who just told them what a great job ivermectin does to whatever they recommended it for, right?
Yep.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that person is authoritative on the use of ivermectin, right? And so
Yeah.
trust and authority, trust is between an individual and an individual, or an individual and a site, a publisher site, right? Whereas authority is it has additional layers to it. So it's really quite fascinating when you sort of dive down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's funny that, like for a lot of the TikTok and Instagram stories and stuff that I see, a lot of that authority is created by, the box of like camera tricks essentially that people use. And like one of my favorite are how everybody's in their car, as if they just parked after like driving somewhere and they're like, I just have to tell you this. And it's such a genre now of sitting, in your car and telling somebody some truth about the world.
Right,
Uh, but, and like that doesn't make somebody, have more profound truth for you just because they like had to pull over and tell you like what's on their mind. And yet that it's so effective in terms of like getting people to believe.
right,
Um,
right. So back to the content that you and your teams are creating. I'm curious whether you make decisions around sort of the additional modalities of that content. For example, do you sometimes say, well, this content would benefit from being communicated not just purely textually, but with an infographic? Right? Or would it make sense to even do a short video on this, which that raises the bar of content creation costs dramatically. So I would imagine probably not, but certainly infographics like in that gray zone where you're like, oh, it's a little bit of it's a complicated thing we're trying to get across here.
yeah,
Depth of tread on snow tire. Like, does that benefit from an infographic or an image?
absolutely. I mean, already with the e-commerce stuff, we're following what I think are industry trends where the writers are taking their own pictures. And again, it's sort of like, the rhetoric of the image, because the more low res it is, the more it looks like somebody did it on their phone, the better it is. Uh, if they like took a very professional picture of it with like great lighting and like perfect background, that doesn't, seem to get as much traffic because it seems like it could be AI generated or who knows what.
Yeah, it's
Um,
funny you mentioned that because I think there's like in certain of the social medias at the moment, there's almost like a resurgence of like a passion for the older digital cameras, right? Because they add this sort of almost like it's like a fake historical type picture because the color is not as good and it's much lower resolution, different than a phone would do at a lower resolution, but it's just sort of weird Like people are starting on eBay this, dig up their old, 12-year-old, point and shoot cameras because they have a certain look to them. It's, it's sort of the digital equivalent of like a sepia black and white picture, right? It's like it conveys something.
Yeah, yeah. And, and it conveys a kind of like credibility and authority, even if it's just because it's old, which is
Right?
also, it's funny because sometimes old things are like very valuable and sometimes old things are just junk. And it's sort of like depends on the whim of the consumer. But yeah, I mean, right now, because we're in the beginning stages, we're definitely very text focused.
Hmm.
We just need to create like a body of content that we can that covers all of the bases, and demonstrates that our sites have, authority in addition to like their news authority, but also in their like evergreen like product recommendation type authority. And we were lucky because Time, like I said, already had an affiliate program with a different sort of vendor before we stepped in. So we probably benefited from that when we launched last year. Um, but but absolutely, I mean, like I was talking with my publishing industry buddies last night. There are some things that don't monetize, and initially, your bosses will be like, well, if it doesn't monetize, what's the point? But um, but there's like certain brand building that goes along with that kind of stuff that can be very useful. So, like doing timely pieces on Time or AP News, that's what they do. They do timely news. But what we're doing may also benefit the brand, like Time Stamped, which is the Time affiliate brand, or AP Byline, which is our AP brand. It'll benefit from us doing more investigative stuff. Like Wells Fargo, for example, just came out with a new credit card, and like it's gotten some buzz. It was written up in the Wall Street Journal and stuff. We need reporters who can write about those things intelligently, even though it's not, evergreen SEO type material. But my favorite example is my old job, Investopedia, which started off as a totally online encyclopedia by a couple of finance grad students. They like After they were acquired by Dotdash, they really wanted to go for that old school cred. So now they create a paper magazine that you can buy in your local bookstore, and there are like no affiliate links in a paper magazine. That is for sure.
Although there could be with QR codes, but
Yeah, no, that's fair. I didn't even think about that. That's a good
yeah.
idea, actually. I'm gonna steal it.
I mean, the QR codes were resuscitated from oblivion as a result of the pandemic. You couldn't order in a restaurant if you didn't know how to
Right.
use them, and we've layered them into direct mail in a creative way under that it's direct mail division. We've got this Inceptor product that puts a custom QR code on every piece of mail, so every recipient gets their own QR code, which just
Wow.
opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities, but it also removes friction for the consumer or the B2B recipient, right? So it's actually a win-win for everybody. So I could certainly see in a magazine context that, within ads, I've started to see within, the few printed magazines that I still receive, that QR codes have started to make their way into the advertising. I hadn't really thought about how that could happen in a native in article context yet, but that is absolutely feasible
Oh
to
yeah.
to, to be more native.
I wonder, I mean, so how do you personalize the QR code? I mean, you obviously know the address or whatever of the person who
Yeah,
sent
so you
it.
obviously know it's basically with variable digital printing, which it used to be all the printing was lithographic, right? And it used to be that it was so expensive to print stuff on a high capacity four color laser that you had to only that was only for small runs, right? And you would never do a large run. But as the prices of those forms of printing dropped dramatically to the point where, under certain numbers of recipients, it's actually equally, valid to do four color laser that allows you to do mail merges and not just change your name and address on something, which would typically be done with an inkjet last minute, on just the envelope or just a portion of the piece. Now you can actually merge content together from different places, completely personalize the recipient's direct mail piece. And it's already been done just from a messaging and message block perspective. And there's also, my team had already been doing like stuff where they put the person's picture of the person's house on a real estate mailing, right? And so skipping from that to a QR code was actually not as big of a leap as I thought it was going to be when I asked, "Can you do this?" Right? They were like, "Oh yeah, like we're already doing variable digital printing, right? So it's not that big of a deal. We just have to make sure we don't mix it up so that Will Kenton doesn't get his next door neighbor's QR code, right?
Right.
So as long as but that's just the data, best practices in data handling, right? So as long as you handle the data properly, you can in fact create. They used to have personalized URLs, for example. That was sort of like version 1.0 of this. Was you might receive a credit card company mailing, and you would go to bank name / W Kenton, and then that would be your personalized URL with your personalized offer, right?
Right.
This is just adding a friction removing layer to that, right? By doing the variable digital printing of a QR code on there. And we use an in-between hop, right? So we don't go directly to the landing page, because the landing page would typically want things like UTM parameters on it, which make the QR code too dense
Right.
to render very easily. So you want to have a layer, a piece of middleware, which is what we built on the Inceptor site to basically do that, right? That becomes the hop that the click goes through when the person scans it. And there are a bunch of other places that you can source, sort of the Bitly QR code versions of Bitly, right? There
Right.
are the places you can source that. Ours just happens to be direct mail centric, but we've got clients using it on outdoor advertising because they want to know the difference between the placement they have in Grand Central and the placement they have at Penn Station and see which one's
Right.
actually generating the responses. So there's a different QR code on the different placements. So,
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun stuff you can do in that area. So final question. Oh, go ahead.
Well, that's it's just fascinating because like we recently brought on a guy who who was working at Maxim. He's like a magazine guy, and he's going to do the e-commerce for AP Byline. But he was also working for Dollar Shave Club, and he was talking about, doing these like small runs of magazines, like physical magazines that you would mail out to members of Dollar Shave Club, and how great it was, not only for like conversions, because, when you get that magazine, you want to buy your Dollar Shave, but also it was driving a lot of traffic to their website, and they were able to track that. But I mean, it would really be something else. I mean, I was talking about how, newspapers and magazines lost their classified ads, but if they could do that kind of like bigger sort of direct mailing so that I get my copy of Time Magazine or whatever, but in it is a personalized QR code for like, deals for me,
Yeah.
that would really change the game.
Yeah, that's possible actually now. What one would typically do in that scenario, and again, I'm not an expert on printing, but I've learned more than I care to about it as a result of having a division. But typically in a magazine, uh, old school magazine printing environment, the thing that they would tend to swap out would either be the cover, right? And you could do like the front and back of the cover, so that's basically 4 pages, and the internal piece where the staple goes through if it's a staple type, right? So you could dynamically have that. Those two could be customized to the individual recipient. So and you could put more than one in that middle piece, right? Because you would have your standard content that's the same for everybody. You don't want to have to publish the whole thing on lasers. That's not efficient if you're selling People magazine, right? You need to go on a lithographic press for that, right? But you could conceivably start to segment out portions of the printed magazine and dynamically and create hyper personalized content there. So I probably should be chatting with some of these folks about that because I've already written the tech, right? So I hadn't thought about that particular use case.
Yeah, no, but that would definitely shift the dynamic, because it would mean that the publishers could have a direct relationship again with the readers instead of
Yeah,
going like Facebook or Google or whatever.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I've already written the tech, so I guess I should place a couple of calls on that just for fun, if no other reason. But final question for you is really about, how you think about the content creation process. Do you anticipate, or do you sort of project out that each of your pieces of content will be a winner, or do you have more of a portfolio approach where you sort of realize, probably 1 out of 10 is going to be a gigantic hit, then like three more are going to be okay, and then we'll probably have a few dogs.
Yeah. I mean, like I had this conversation with one of the data scientists at Dash back in the day, and I was like, it's a Pareto principle. It's an 80-20 split always.
Yeah.
It's like 20% of the content is going to make 80% of the revenue. And then it's like you've got a long tail of pieces that occasionally will hit or at least get enough traffic to like pay off their existence.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, why don't we just cut off, the part of the, the slope or whatever that like doesn't make money. And I'm like, but you still have the 80-20 split. It's like one of those fractals. Like if you go in, it's like it's the same thing.
Right. Well, the other part is you don't know the winners ahead of time. That's like saying, oh yeah, I'm going to start a band. We're only going to do top 40.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
We're
very
only
nice.
gonna get
Yeah,
top
good
10
job.
minutes. Seriously. I mean, maybe if like you're the Beatles or something, but I'm sure they had no idea what they were doing either.
Right. Right. I mean, but you think about the role of an A&R person at a record company, to the extent those still exist, or like a producer of content, for Amazon or Netflix or whomever, right? They all have their 80-20 rule. And right. And of course their bosses would prefer that they only do the hits. Right? But
Yeah.
we don't always know ahead of time if it's going to be the hit or not.
I know. Well, actually, I mean, it's funny you should mention it because, back in the Dash days, we were talking about subscription models, and like what you need to have to make a subscription model successful. And what you have to have is a lot of content. And you know that like some of it isn't going to perform, like if you have like a Netflix where people are going to scroll through, even if you like are good at dynamically recommending stuff to them and their preferences and their behaviors and whatever, you still have to have some of that stuff that just isn't going to make it.
Right. Yep, absolutely. Well, it's been great having you on as a guest, Will. We covered a lot of different ground. So it's really exciting what you're working on, and it seems like it's got some significant upside. So look forward
Yeah,
to
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.